Good afternoon, distinguished guests. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Nanisha Chantautit. It's my pleasure on behalf of TMA to welcome you all to our third event of TMA ESG series under the theme of climate change and net zero. First and foremost, before we start, I would like to invite Ms. Premtip Kamonsak-Kamjorn, Senior Manager of Thailand Management Association, to give us the welcome speech.
สวัสดีค่ะ Good afternoon everyone. I'm Premtip Kamonsak-Kamjorn. On behalf of TMA, Thailand Management Association, we are proud to honor to welcome you on board today to our third event of TMA ESG seminar today. As every company, we are under increasing the pressure to commit net zero target. Today, we will take you to explore the key challenge and opportunity for net zero target, including some example for the best practice for in action from the leading company. So I would like to express my sincere thanks to our speaker, knowledge partner, and also all sponsors who make us to the this series possible in this time. And please enjoy our informative webinar today. I hope you're gonna get all inspiration and benefit to you. Stay safe, be healthy, and thank you to be here today. ขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you very much, Khun Premtip, for the warm welcome speech. Before we start, if you have any questions about the presentation, you can send it to us by Q&A function on the upper right corner of the screen. Our speaker will be pleased to answer them during the Q&A session. And we also have polling questions. We have prepared 5 interesting questions about net zero, and you can choose 3 of them by clicking the polling link as below image. You may submit the polling at any time during the presentation. We will collect and address them during the panel discussion. So you will have an opportunity to participate in the panel discussion as well. Next, I would like to introduce our speakers who will give us a special presentation. Mr. Jeff Amrish Ritu, Vice President, Legal and Commercial at BCPR Company Limited. Dr. Natthakon Kraikun, Acting Vice President, Circular Economy at PTT Global Chemical Public Company Limited. Mr. Poom Sirapapasiri, Assistant Vice President, Global Partnership for Sustainability and Communications, Jaran Pokapan Group Company Limited. And our first speaker of this session, please join me welcome Mr. Brad Denick, Managing Director, Innovation for Sustainability at AWR Lloyd, who will introduce net zero and help us clarify net zero target. Welcome.
Thank you, Khun Natnisha, and a great privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. So as mentioned, Brad Denig, Managing Director of Innovation for Sustainability at AWR Lloyd. Our presentation today will be on corporate commitments to decarbonization. We'll focus on what are some of the good practices and some of the practices to avoid when establishing and meeting a net zero target. First thing first, though, is despite the preoccupation with the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis continues and accelerates. So we've seen record-breaking temperatures in the Pacific Northwest that have led to a couple of hundred deaths recently. We continue to see increasing flooding, sea level rise, and wildfires. Just last year, we had $260 billion in estimated economic losses from natural disasters. Those are often exacerbated by climate change impacts. And this is not going to let up. Estimates are for 14% reduction in global GDP by 2050, and an estimated 250,000 global deaths per year between 2030 and 2050 from climate change. Because of this, there needs to be an all hands on deck approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. So what are net zero emissions? They are defined by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, so human caused, are balanced by anthropogenic removals over a specific period. Now, certainly in this decade, we are completely out of balance, but by 2050 is when this needs to be in balance to align with the Paris Agreement in 1.5 degrees. So there is some good news in that corporate commitment to decarbonization is on the rise. So if we look at just the Fortune 500, back in 2016, only 6% had a commitment that aligned with the Paris Agreement. Now, when we compare that to end of year last year, that has increased 5.5 times to 33%. Of that 33%, 56% are carbon neutral or net zero, 45% science-based target, and 35% RE100. When we look at Thailand, so the 100 largest publicly listed companies on the Stock Exchange of Thailand, we found that 6 out of 100 have a net zero target. 2 out of those 6 address scope 3 emissions in their net zero target. 2 out of 6 also have a net zero target by 2030, and 4 out of 6 have absolute based reduction targets. However, there is some bad news in that the overall reviews for corporate commitments to decarbonization are not entirely great. So if we look at Dr. Jonathan Foley from the influential Project Drawdown, he had mentioned that sadly the net zero concept has been misused by bad or indifferent actors, allowing them to make bold sounding climate pledges without really reducing emissions at all. Some of those reviews focus on the fact that many companies are pushing their net zero target to 2050 or beyond with no interim targets in 2030, 2040, or they are relying too much on carbon offsetting and not taking enough drastic action this decade to reduce emissions. So in order to avoid that kind of bad publicity and to be misaligned with what's really needed, there's a few questions that should be addressed in your net zero target. So first is what is included. So it should address scope 1 and 2 and 3, which is the most difficult because it is not in companies' control and is often very large. As well, all material greenhouse gases. So not just CO2, but if relevant, then also methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases. Secondly is when will it be achieved? There's great urgency, so it requires net zero no later than 2050. And as mentioned, it's very important to have short and medium interim targets. The third component is how will it be achieved? So are you transparent with the roadmap of how you're going to achieve emission reductions? Is there a role for your company in carbon offsets, but to what extent do you use them and do you over rely on them? So those are the 3 key questions. The concern right now and the fear is that there's urgent action required, yet many corporate net zero targets, they don't provide detail, they don't have interim targets, and they rely too much on carbon offsets. So let's quickly do a crash course on issue number 1, what is included? So this is an overview of greenhouse gas accounting. So the first thing is, what are the different greenhouse gases? And the first 3 make up the vast majority of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are human caused, from CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. The next thing is to focus on scope 1 emissions. This is emissions that companies, they're direct emissions and that they often have the most control over. The most common are stationary and mobile, but often, depending on the industry, both process emissions and fugitive emissions can be significant. The second is scope 2 emissions. So this is all of the electricity, steam, heating, cooling that you are using, but it's generated at a power plant and you're connected through the grid. Many net zero targets rightfully focus on scope 1 and 2 because they can have immediate control or influence over those emissions. However, the big story here is scope 3 emissions. They're difficult to quantify, but they are typically larger than scope 1 and 2 combined, often by a factor of 6 or greater, and they include both upstream and downstream. Now there's 15 categories, but we're just showing a few of them here. The most important in upstream is purchased goods and services in aggregate. It depends by company, but roughly 45% of all scope 3 emissions are purchased goods and services, according to a study by CDP. When we look at downstream emissions, processing of sold products can be significant, but often the largest is use of sold products, and that as well is roughly 45% of total Scope 3 emissions. So again, we're looking at Scope 3 because they're the largest source of emissions, but they're a source of great market opportunity and as well as risk. So here you're seeing that use of sold products, right? The dark red is your downstream, and then purchased goods and services upstream. According to a study by CDP, that's roughly 90% of all Scope 3 emissions, those two categories. So if we look at this by industry, if we're looking at coal mining, right? Coal mining, its emissions will be downstream, selling a ton of coal to a power plant. That becomes that power plant Scope 1 emissions, but is the coal miner's Scope 3 emissions. So that's very significant. And that 94% in the middle means that Scope 3 emissions in aggregate are 94% of that industry's total Scope 1, 2, and 3. This is according to we've looked at the 3 largest companies per sector, and so that's a proxy number for total emissions. Auto industry, again, there's a lot of emissions associated with manufacture of products, but the majority of emissions are downstream in the use phase of those automobiles. It changes as you go into different sectors. Consumer durables is more broad, and then food processing, the majority of its emissions are upstream in the purchased goods and services. We won't go over the other industries, but this presentation will be available to attendees and can review this information later. The next part of what you need in your net zero target is to address when is it going to be achieved. And it's very crucial because right now we are on track for 3 degrees of temperature rise, and we need 7.6% annual reduction in global greenhouse gases this decade, right, to align with a Paris Agreement of holding temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We've put in here this kind of lifetime icons because one thing that can be frustrating in communicating to folks about climate change is they tend to put off 2100 as if it's generations away, but it's really within the lifetime of folks born this decade, and they will see amazing changes of a radical transformation of our economy to one that is truly net zero, and we are sequestering more carbon than we're emitting for the latter half of this century. One thing I will highlight is this dark gray line is called P4 in the IPCC. That is the worst case scenario for us to align with Paris Agreement. It's where we don't really do much over this decade, or not enough. And it ends up creating a scenario where we rely on carbon reductions to the tune of 20 gigatons per year by the end of this century. That would require 700 million hectares of land, Australia, to somehow magically be found to grow bioenergy crops for bioenergy carbon capture sequestration. So not an ideal scenario. The third part of a net zero target is how will you reduce emissions? So here's illustrative good practice. You're a company that last year had 35 million tons of Scope 3, 8 million tons of Scope 1, and 4 million tons of Scope 2. You want to set a net zero target in 2050. The most essential thing to do is to develop plans with interim targets for how you will reduce Scope 1 and 2 is perhaps where you can have the most influence, as well as address your Scope 3 emissions. Over time, you can also use carbon removals or offsets, the gray boxes there, where then you can achieve net zero. Some companies will even go beyond that to have more carbon sequestration or removals than they emit so that they become carbon positive. In addition, you need a roadmap and actions, and that should include clear detail for Scope 1, 2, and 3, how you will achieve your emission reductions. This is very high level for this purpose, but a good company practice will provide a lot of detail and transparency of what initiatives you're relying on to reduce emissions. On offsetting and removals, you should have a clear strategy as well as focus on SDG co-benefits. In addition, you need awareness and disclosure, so carbon metrics, and perhaps the most important one is what's the carbon intensity per dollar of CapEx. That will tell you your future, right? It won't tell you so much how you produce this carbon intensity in this year or the previous year, but it tells you if you are making investments that are on track with a 1.5 degree scenario. Also important to have carbon pricing, internal carbon pricing, and scenario analysis, ideally using TCFD framework. The very last part is, what's your investment and innovation strategy? Do you have a corporate venture capital unit that's focused on the need to decarbonize? Is your M&A strategy aligned with the need to decarbonize? What new business units, products and services and partnerships are you using as well to achieve that? Staying on the innovation theme, a quote from Tim Cook, CEO of Apple: "If you're an executive who has not developed a strategy to address your impact on the climate, then you are failing in your duties as a leader." Agree. And so we've provided an example here of scope 3 emissions opportunities and targets for Ford. So this is for Ford, they have emissions primarily from the company's use of sold products. Their opportunity is electric vehicles, and they've established a target to reduce scope 3 emissions 50% by investing $22 billion to engineer and introduce EVs. Glencore has scope 3 emissions as well from the use of sold products such as thermal coal. Their primary opportunity is clean tech metals, copper being one that will thrive in a decarbonization scenario. So 35% reduction in scope 3 by 2035 for them. Part of that is through depleting of oil and coal reserves, but much of it is through the investment into copper, cobalt, and nickel. All are needed for batteries and renewables. And then lastly, we have an example from Kellogg's. Their scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions have a lot of methane, and this is their upstream emissions. Their opportunity is plant proteins, and to reduce scope 3 50% by 2050 and 20% by 2030. So all this is to suggest that when you're looking at scope 3, which is why your net zero target should at least address it, is that it can be a proxy for market opportunity, and it requires that reorientation of company strategy to one that very leans in on climate. Our last point here is, what's the appropriate use of offsets? So offsetting, especially nature-based solutions, are getting a lot of traction right now, and for good reason. They can get us about 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas reductions we need this decade at an affordable option as well. The things that we would suggest are that these nature-based solutions should not just focus on the carbon offsetting that you're getting, but they should, first of all, they should just be a part of your strategy, not the core of your strategy. The second part is they should really look to leverage commitments to sustainable development goals, circular economy, regenerative business, biocircular economy, et cetera. When done well, investments into nature provide far more benefits than simply carbon removals and sequestration. So our last slide here is, how do we work with companies through our innovation for sustainability practice to achieve net zero? So we started with three key questions, right, for your net zero. What is included, scope 1, 2, and 3, and doing the accounting for that? Not necessarily where we focus, but on when will it be achieved and how will it be achieved, the strategy. That's what our services are intended for. So on the one hand, it's commercial due diligence, so techno-economic feasibility studies of low carbon technologies and business models, strategy and communications, so developing corporate strategy to align with rapid decarbonization, and then providing corporate communications. And then M&A and venture development, so we support B teams on accelerating their decarbonization plans through financial advisory, and then support strategy and innovation teams with co-developing ventures and or developing CVC units. For example, we've been engaged for a number of years on natural capital and have helped co-develop a business that's ready to support companies on nature-based solutions. Core areas of focus for us include EVs, natural capital, energy metals, renewables, and microgrids. Thank you, and also really want to thank all of the team that contributed to this presentation. So thanks very much, and look forward to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Denik. Next speaker who will share us deeper information about net zero in terms of opportunities and challenges. Please welcome Mr. Jeff Amrish Ritu from BCPR Company Limited. Please welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see the screen. The angle that I've chosen for this presentation is to make the link between the importance of securing critical minerals today in order to realize a clean energy system tomorrow. And I would like to start to talk about the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2015, over 190 countries ratified this agreement, a very unique event in the history of mankind, with so much commitment from so many different countries to battle global warming. And these countries agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, obviously, doing that is a very big challenge. It's a daunting task, as you can see in this graph here. If we were to limit global warming to 2 degrees, we would seriously have to reduce GHG emissions, let alone if we go for 1.5 degrees Celsius that Brad was referring to in his speech. That means most likely reducing the GHG emissions with 50% by 2030. So it's a daunting task. At the same time, it also offers business opportunities, especially for those companies that are looking at electrification opportunities in, for instance, transportation, and companies that are active or want to become active in renewable energy. There is another aspect, which is energy savings, but that is beyond the scope of today's presentation for me. So electrification of transport is a very nice opportunity to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see from the graph here, the yellow line represents transport. So transport is really one of the biggest emitters when it comes to economical activities. However, greenifying transportation and electrifying transportation is just one of the first steps really to contribute to the targets of the Paris Climate Agreement. It is very important that the backside of that electrification process, i.e. Power generation, also becomes cleaner. Therefore, what we will see over the next coming years is that renewables and clean energy technology will take a larger portion of the energy mix. As you can see here, by 2050, Bloomberg New Energy Finance projects that things like solar PV, wind farms, and battery storage will take a larger portion of the energy mix as today. Now, the challenge with these things is that clean energy systems, such as solar, such as wind, but also electrical cars, require more critical minerals than their fossil fuel-based counterparts. So to give an example, electric cars require 9 times more critical minerals than a conventional internal combustion engine car. The same applies for solar and wind. An offshore wind farm requires 12 times more critical minerals than a natural gas-fired power plant. So where is the opportunity then, you might think? Well, the good news is that all economic powers in the world, from Europe, China to the US, have electrification of transport as their top priority. The focus is a little bit different. So Europe is very much focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and their target is to reduce that with 55% compared to 1990. China is very much focused on building a domestic independent EV supply chain. But the message for all these 3 big economic powers is the same. All of them will invest heavily in EV and in EV infrastructure. And that explains also these numbers that the IEA presented in April this year. As you can see from this graph, depending on the scenario that we're looking at, net zero, in a net zero situation, EVs and battery storage will become the biggest contributor to the demand of critical minerals. So what is required to supply that the critical minerals that we need to accelerate the green and clean energy transition? We need 2 things. First of all, we need quality resources, basically good mines. And we need good mines to produce enough critical minerals. As you can see from this graph from Macquarie Research, they expect that next year we will reach a deficit for lithium, for instance. That creates bottlenecks when it comes to the mining capacity. But the same applies to refining. You need to refine the critical minerals that you mine before you can actually put them into the batteries or in the EVs eventually. And at the moment, there is not sufficient global refining capacity to meet the demand for high purity metals. So there are 80 billion reasons to look at mining and processing. And the reason why I say 80 billion is because of this graph. If you look at this graph, a lot of money is flowing into the downstream applications of green tech, so lithium batteries and EVs. But the expectation is that by 2025, there will be 1 terawatt hour of demand in lithium battery capacity. Now, 1 terawatt hour in demand requires 800 tons of lithium, 200 tons of nickel, and 800 tons of cobalt, and 625 tons of natural graphite. So that's a lot of ingredients that are required to go into each battery cell. And all these minerals require conversion and processing to upgrade the minerals into battery grade before they can go into the battery. Now, how does it look like for Europe, for instance? A very brief case study. Europe wants to have 10 million EVs sold in 2030. If we suppose that, if we assume that the average EV has battery pack of 60 kilowatt hours, like the Tesla Model 3, then Europe alone will need 600 gigawatt hours in battery capacity. And that 600 gigawatt hours will require 360,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent. And to put that in context, that's today's global production, meaning in the next decade, Europe will need as much lithium as the whole world is producing today. So that's a tremendous task. On top of that, Europe wants high energy density batteries. They want high quality batteries. In order to reach that and to get that, they need to refine the lithium as well. So there will be another layer on top that could create bottlenecks, which is the refining capacity, as you can see here. 80% of today's refining capacity for lithium hydroxide takes place in China. Europe at the moment has zero capacity for refining. So how to seize these opportunities? Basically, I would say invest in upstream, invest in mining and early processing of critical minerals. But then as soon as you have done that, on the back of that, try to get a partnership with people downstream, whether that is a battery producer or an EV producer. What that will bring you is two things. First of all, by bringing in the downstream end user, you will be able to modify your product early on, and that will save you cost, and it will help you in the marketing of your product because you basically tweak your product to meet the demand downstream at an early stage. But most importantly, today, most Western countries are looking for clean products. They are looking for products that have a clean ESG track record. And by having partners that put a lot of relevance and importance on ESG requirements early on in the process, you will make your life easier, and therefore also the marketability of your product easier. And in the end, you will have a higher chance to put a premium on top of your product. So how could it look like? This is a one-page summary. Suppose you get lithium offtake, like Bangchak. You could then work together with a processor and the tier one end customer, for instance, an EV manufacturing company, and really try to work together to clean the product, make it of higher purity, but in a way that meets the ESG requirements from the end markets. And with that, I've reached the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you, everyone, and also, again, AWR Lloyd and TMA for giving us the opportunity to share our thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ritu. Before we move to our next presentation, just to remind you that we have the polling questions, and you can choose 3 questions before we start the panel discussion. Now, Please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Natthakon Graikun from PTT Global Chemical Public Company Limited, who will share us the best practices from leading organizations and how they went through to commit to net zero. Please welcome.
So I guess it's good. So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank for the organizers and also other speakers to having me today. I think major topics that I'm going to share to the floor today is how PTT Global Chemicals develop strategies and put it in actions towards our net zero goals. First of all, let me trying to introduce our corporate for a short period. PTT Global Chemicals, we are actually the petrochemical flagships of PTT Groups. Our business covers a major 7 business units, starting from upstream of petrochemicals to downstream of petrochemicals. So we have refineries, aromatics, olefins, down to polymers, EO-based chemicals, green chemicals, performance chemicals, and also phenols. And in terms of the capacities, I think we are on the top ranks in Thailand and also in the regions for petrochemical capacities. And currently, I think we have internationals and locals both operating sites and sales globally. And as you can see on this page that based on our current business that deals with petrochemical productions, so we are fully aware that during the process, there are going to be lots of energy that we need to use. And also there are going to be some emission that could be created during the process. So this is why we put our commitments on our best efforts to manage this kind of the emission that's going to produce from our productions. And not just only, I mean, we are aware that our process produce some kinds of the greenhouse gas. We also see some kind of the trends globally that indicate that in near futures, what we have done today may not be, I mean, the practices for tomorrow. So they're going to be a kind of the impact to our operation in the long term, particularly for a sustainability aspect. We have seen some trends and requirements from our shareholders and stakeholders that they would like us to explain on how the companies deals with a sustainability aspect, not just trying to say that we trying to exclude to not doing things, but they would like to do how we could integrate the sustainability into our main business and how to measure the impacts. So for PTTGC, we see that sustainability is going to be the next wave that impacts our operation in the futures, in both terms of the competitiveness, because we're going to face a kind of the carbon tax, carbon borders, and also other financial instruments that going to impact the cost and competitiveness in the futures. And we also see a kind of the opportunity for our growth as well. So by having the right frameworks to do sustainabilities, we think that this could be the aspect that we could preserve our long-term competitiveness towards the value protections and also create additional values to our stakeholders. And based on the discussion internally, when we would like to set up the frameworks for the corporate, we also trying to ensure that our approach is aligned with the global aspects. So then we're trying to see how people deal with the climate action globally. And we found that based on the research from Allen MacArthur's foundations, actually, when we would like to deal with the emission from the company, there are 2 major aspects that we need to take care. One hand is on the energy utilization, how to better deal with this kind of the things. In the other hand, it should be the product that we produce, how we could make it become, lower impacts when compared with the year before or compared with others. And the circular economy concept would be the really critical aspect that we need to incorporate in our net zero strategy as well. And this is why on left-hand side, you can see that when we trying to set up the frameworks to accomplish the net zero emission, we're saying that we need to integrate the yellow one, the orange one, we call responsible production, meaning that what we have to, what product that we're going to produce from our facility. We need to ensure that we utilize the resources, including the energy in effective way. And also what product that we're going to put into the market. We need to ensure that we will fully apply the circular economy concept to ensure that they're not going to harm the environment. And we will close the loop to bring back the raw material to the loop as well, to reduce the virgin raw material consumptions. And we fully aware that by doing so in the good shape, there could be some emission left that we need to handle. So this is why we still have the green color here, says compensation, meaning that we will trying to find a way to compensate the left emission as well. So there are going to be three major aspects that we're going to put into our strategy to drive the net zero. And a little bit into more detail, in the orange one, we call it as a responsible productions. We're gonna deal with our asset that we have today and tomorrow using the technologies. First tier, we're gonna try to put the off-the-shelf technology to enhance our efficiencies. And the second tier, we're gonna have our R&D working with the corporate venture capital teams, trying to identify what could be the novel technologies that we should deploy to our process in the futures. So it's going to be the technology that allow us to use the lower carbon energy, for example, renewable energy or hydrogen to replace, for example, natural gas. And also what will be the low carbon processes that allow us to produce the same products, but with the lower emissions. So these are one of the aspects that we intend to do. Another aspect on the product, we're saying that at the origins of the products, we will trying to ensure that what we have offers to the customer is the best products. We will do a kind of the portfolio adjustments to ensure that in the futures, the future business of the corporate will be the one with the lower emissions covering scope 1, 2, 3. So this is why we trying to set up the team to explore the new high value business. Either it's going to be the clean tech or the one that you may have heard recently is that we aim to get into the coatings business that provide us the good returns, but with the lower emissions compared with our base business today. So this is one of the portfolio aspect that we would like to do. Another thing we aim to build the so-called low carbon and eco products portfolio to offer to our customer. So it's going to be by providing the new application that allow them to use the lower resources to produce the same products, or incorporate the bio-based content into our products, or build the recycling product portfolio to offer to our customer. So this is another lever that we believe that it's not just only help GC, but it will help our customer to decarbonize their value chain as well. And to ensure that our customer will fully and also be able to utilize this kind of the product, we aim to build the application portfolio and upcycling portfolio as well to help them in order to adopt more this kind of the low carbon material into their products. After the end life of this product, we also have the intention to stop the waste from our products as well. So this is why we're trying to set up the waste management practice with the publics, and also trying to create ecosystem with our partners. So we would like to raise awareness to the publics and also develop the mechanism to collect and then manage the waste, the plastic after the use, to not create any additional waste to the public. And we are now trying to build the technology portfolio as well in order to allow the plastic waste to be converted in the good manners. And then this can going back to the loop, being used as raw material to produce the new material. And also on the green compensation, we're now trying to explore on the new technology in the futures. So our CVC team is now trying to identify what could be the really economic feasible carbon capture, storage and utilization for GC for being deployed in the futures. And we are also trying to execute the natural gas solution in parallels in order to lower the emission left from our own activities. This page we're trying to highlight a kind of the examples that I trying to mention. For example, in the orange colors, responsible production, what we have done today is trying to maximize efficiency of the process, reduce the steams that we're going to use, trying to adapt more renewable energy to the process. And also we have a digitalization roadmap to adopt into our existing asset and trying to maximize the efficiency matched to the technology limitations. And we, like I said, that we have set up a R&D and CVC team to explore for the low carbon energy and processes for being deployed to our asset in the futures. For the blue areas offer the best, like I said, that we're trying to build the low carbon and eco product portfolio, not just for us to lower the carbon footprint, but also trying to help our customer to decarbonize their products as well. So we're trying to build the performance resin portfolio that will include the down gauging, monomaterials, and others engineering plastic that have been certified with the carbon footprint labels and also carbon footprint reduction labels. Also, we're trying to build the recycling portfolio. Currently, we're trying to set the PET and HDPE as the major products. We're trying to build the bio-based portfolio, covering from chemicals, plastic, and also fuels to help our customer to lower their emissions. And we also have the customer design center to help our customer, to design and find way to adopt this kind of the material to their products. And we also develop the, like I said, the applications portfolio to demonstrate the success of utilizing this kind of the products into the real product. In terms of the stop the waste, we're trying to develop ecosystem with our partners, starting from waste collections to the, hub, separating hub, collecting hub, and also connecting to the recycling manufacturers and the one who produce the end product through applications. So currently we have multiple partners starting from governments, institutes, university to the public and private companies to help doing this kind of the thing. And we're trying to adopt this kind of the model to address the current, concern to the public. For example, during COVID situation, people will concerns on the health care as the most, but we're trying to demonstrate that by managing the plastic waste, effectively, we can incorporate circular economy views with the healthcare. For example, we're trying to introduce the medical gown to the hospitals that this gown trying to use the fully recycled material to make this kind of gown. And also we developed the campaign called how to separate the infected waste in order to raise awareness that if we manage the infected waste very well, for example, your mask, we can allow the other kind of the waste to be put back to the loop and makes the recycling become more effectively. This kind of thing is the campaign that we're trying to advocate the public and develop the campaign to help make them more aware and be part of our journeys to close the loop of the plastic. And like I said, that we also trying to build the technology portfolio, starting from mechanical recycling to deal with the sorted waste that we can collect from the drop points or collecting hub to produce the recycling materials. And we also explore the chemical recycling technology as well to extend our ability to convert the waste from just only sorted to be unsorted waste as well in the futures. And based on this kind of the approach, I think GC has, put a really clear roadmaps and our aspiration that previously we saying that we put our commitment to reduce greenhouse gas by 20% and 52% in the futures. But currently we're gonna, uplift our commitment to become the net zeros. And we will trying to set the clear approach, the orange, the blue, and the green, that what will be the levers that we're going to use during the journeys. And currently I think we are now trying under the studying phase to define the clear roadmap. And then after we complete the study, I think you will see more clear a path for the corporate to accomplish the net zero. And also we're saying that by doing this kind of the activity, not just only scope 1 and scope 2, but we will trying to set the target for scope 3 as well, because we're going to do a thing on the portfolio reshapes, and also we're going to create some value chain initiative with our partner to reduce this scope 3 emission as well. So that's going to be all of the, practices and activity that GC has done so far. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing with us, Dr. Natagon. Once again, don't be missed. Our pool is now open, and you can vote 3 questions by clicking the image below on the screen. Another speaker who will share us the examples of net zero in action. Please welcome Mr. Phumsira Prabhasiri from Juran Pokapan Group Company Limited. Please welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you all see my screen? For this opportunity to talk about our climate action journey. CP Group is a collection of companies with businesses in very diverse in areas. We have companies, business units in 21 countries. And our origin, of course, is in agriculture and food. But in the past several decades, there was expansion into new industries such as retail, distribution, telecom, real estate, etc. And in the near future, we are expanding into new areas such as renewable energy, transportation, and medical services. The group is approaching the 100th year this year, 2021. It also marks the first year of our second group-wide sustainability framework that covers 2021 through 2030. So the journey to setting the net zero target began about 5 to 6 years ago, 2015, 2016. So prior to that, right, each operating company has its own goals and targets. Some of the larger ones that you can see on the screen, especially public companies, have set their sustainability targets and strategies several years ago. But many smaller ones, smaller companies did not have such structure in place. So the central sustainability team at the group level serves at pretty much a traditional technical advisory role. And around 2015-16, the group underwent a management transformation with preparing to hand over the group CEO role to his youngest son, Kun Supachai. And back then there was a sustainability framework was developed, and climate change was identified as one of the top materiality issues for the entire group. And through a series of workshops with CEOs and top executives, identified 12 key goals corresponding to the 12 material issues. And for climate change, for the previous framework, it was to be a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas intensity by 2020 compared to 2015 base year. Now, this doesn't sound too ambitious, right? But it helped align the understanding of the different companies within the group and allow the central corporate sustainability team to work with the teams at the business unit level to get all the data collection, definition aligned. And unfortunately, we actually did not meet this target. 2020 was last year, and I think we went up to about 8.9% reduction in intensity instead of 10. So we had to go to the market through the TGO's platform, Thailand Greenhouse Gas Management Office, to purchase carbon offsets to make up the difference. Now, for the second phase of the group sustainability framework that you can see 2020 through 2030, a similar process was initiated 2 years ago, 2019. So once the group new sets of materiality issues were finalized, workshops were conducted for CEOs and sustainability executives for the various companies to come together and agree again on the KPIs and targets. But this time there was one big difference, and that was the target for climate. Now the group CEO, so Mr. Supachai himself, decided that as a group, we must strive towards net zero by 2030. So it was the one top-down target in contrast to the other 14 topics, which followed a bottom-up approach. And after much haggling and wrangling between the group level and the company's level, it was agreed to that, we'll follow the group policy. And at the group level, we decided to join the Race to Zero. and committing ourselves to setting a science-based target. Our net zero targets apply, to be very clear, to scopes 1 and 2 for 2030, and to cover scope 3 as well by 2050. And so once we made that commitment, so what does it mean for the group? So we forecast our emissions from 2020 up to 2030 for scopes 1 and 2, and also for scope 3 in the next slide. And look at what options we have to reduce our net emissions. So this past year, our emissions was about 900,000 tons CO2 equivalent for scope 1 and 4.7 million for scope 2, about 5.6 total combined, right? In 2030, it's estimated that we would reach about 10 million tons CO2 equivalent combined if there's no other mitigation measure. And also for scope 3, projecting out to 2050, so from about 28 million tons CO2 equivalent this year to about 120 absence any mitigation measure. So once we know how much we need to reduce, we need to find ways to reduce it. And you can see scope 3, as Kun Brad already mentioned, scope 3 emissions are much greater than scopes 2 and 1 combined. And that's the main challenge, right? Especially upstream emissions from our farmers that account for about 80% of total food value chain emissions. So in order to get close to net zero, we need to work very closely with our partners, our farmers, and other upstream suppliers. And what are our options? So I'll touch on a few of them. There are 6 key approaches, as you can see, from renewable energy to agricultural practice to reforestation, waste management, etc. Our climate team has been working on the marginal abatement cost analysis and developing informal internal carbon exchange platform to help facilitate emission reductions in the most cost-effective way possible. On renewable, in particular, last year or 2 years ago, 2019, renewable accounted for almost 12% of our total energy consumption, and that was equivalent to saving about 600,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year. But 12% is still a very much more. In Thailand alone, we have about 60 megawatts of installed solar capacity. We want to increase this figure by nearly 100-fold within the next decade to 5,000 megawatts. And so we need to find partners to help us speed up our renewable energy program. Another example, True Corporation, which I used to work at True, being powered by solar energy. 5 years ago, we had fewer than, I think, 70 sites with a solar power system. Right now it's about 1,000, and we aim to reach about 3,000 sites during this first phase, which is still, again, a very small portion of the entire True portfolio. And on agriculture, CPF in particular has been a long-time supporter and proponent of a biogas system. All of our own soy farms, about 96% of the contract farms have biogas systems, so to capture methane from manure management system and wastewater treatment, not just farm, but also food processing facilities, and utilizing it to power and to generate heat and electricity. And I think this is my last slide. So working with partners within the to address scope 3, right? So some of the options for mitigating emissions up and down the value chain. You can see that most of these have very small impact compared to the overall picture. So the key message here is there's really right now no one magic bullet. We need all the options that we can get. And even with all these measures implemented, there will still be remaining emissions that we need to quote unquote offset, and that's where our tree planting programs come in. In Thailand and in China, and also in other countries, we are expanding our reforestation program. We calculated that we need to plant approximately 100 million trees by 2030. And this may sound like a big number, but if you consider that we have about 400,000 employees worldwide, and this is where the size comes in, right? So we are planning to scale up our reforestation program. Be happy to answer and discuss in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sirapapasiri. Well, turning to today's big issue, how to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emission target in terms of business sector, long-term value that our panel discussion today will go into. Well, once again, please join me in welcome our distinguished panelists, Mr. Brad Denick, Mr. Jeff Ambritu, Dr. Natakorn Kraikun, Mr. Poom Sirapapasuri, and not be missed, the moderator of this session, Ms. Shruti Kothari, Head of Communications from HBR Lloyd. We're now closing the poll, and let me hand it over to Ms. Shruti to share the results with everyone.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Nisha. Thank you to all the presenters for those very insightful and candid presentations. And let's just dive straight into this discussion section. So thanks to the audience, we have selected 3 questions. The first one is to do with scope 3. So I will direct this to Brad first, and then I will ask the rest of the panelists as well. What are the most common approaches taken by companies that commit to scope 3, so indirect emissions reductions? Can this be achieved solely by companies, or must they collaborate with peers, competitors, industry groups, or government bodies to achieve this? Brad?
Thank you, Shruti. Yeah, so I would say, kind of as was highlighted in all of the presentations, first is identifying your hotspot of where your emissions are. Then clearly in terms of market orientation, where are the opportunities? But I would say as well, and this was quite clear in all presentations, and perhaps especially in the last one from Poom, reforestation will have to make up a significant part of it. You'll also look for innovations within your value chain, assuming solutions like biochar may be a way to get removals that are relevant to the F&B industry. Others are more difficult. I'm quite curious to hear from Poom Natakorn how they feel about the biocircular economy and bioplastics, which are not as economic today as they need to be. And so that suggests that there needs to be partnership with peers, but also government support if we really want to accelerate decarbonization. Yeah, so those would be some initial ideas, and then of course with Jeff in terms of market opportunity for Bangjak in terms of seizing the clean tech metals strategy that's been very effective in going upstream and seeing that as a traditional energy company, they might have to look into new markets that are different than the oil and gas that they had been and continue to operate within. So anyhow, those would be some of the approaches, and of course, very eager to hear from the other presenters their opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Poom, I would like to move straight on to you. As you did talk to some degree about scope 3, could you elaborate a little bit on partnerships, collaboration?
Right. I think the diversity of the businesses under the group, right, that is the most challenging factor. But we can focus, as Brad mentioned, the hotspots, and I mentioned the food value chain. Of course, other industries within the group also have significant scope 3, but let's focus on the farmers. And the most relevant let me, for example, rice cultivation. So CP is also involved in rice. So we have Royal Umbrella Rice, and we have been working with academia in terms of methane management from rice paddy. So having to work and educate and experiment with farmers in the field with help from experts both in Thailand and also from other countries such as the Rice NAMA program to help address methane from rice. So I think that the key is working very closely and sincerely with our partners, and actually aligning the incentive that if we ask our partner farms to do something that would cost them money and time, we need to ensure that we're recognizing their effort. Beyond rice, of course, there's the maize, corn growing. That was a big environmental issues in terms of both forest encroachment and residue burning. So in the past 5 years, we have been working with suppliers to guarantee that our corn plant people who supply corn to our feed business do not encroach on forests. And so in order to support that, we need very strong traceability system. So the structure from our end, we have to be ready in order to work with our partners. And mentioning the government sector, of course, we would welcome clear and enforceable policy from the state to help business first to get a level playing field, to make sure that the business that are trying to do the right thing gets recognized and not penalized by the market with this uneven playing field. And also again, I think the going back to the question, can we do this alone? Of course not. Maybe in very few industry that the business can influence most of the emission sources in the scope 3, perhaps, but for companies like for food company, agricultural company, and also many other within the group, I think the key is very close and very effective, very sincere collaboration with our partners in our value chain.
Thank you, Kun Poon. Thank you very much. Kun Jeff, would you like to go next?
Yes, absolutely. I echo what Kun Poon and Kun Brad said, and I'll give you an example. There is a lot of talk about battery recycling these days as one of the options to meet that incremental demand that will flood us soon. Obviously, that's not enough to meet that demand, but we as Bangchak have been looking at setting up a battery recycling facility in Southeast Asia. And one of the challenges that you immediately rush into is, distribution. And I myself am from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, all the used batteries are collected by semi-governmental organizations. They collect all of that stuff for the recyclers. And that is a tremendous advantage that you have. And if we were to have that here in Thailand, it would be great because it would really solve that infrastructural issue. And we wouldn't need to have to search for all those used batteries. Basically, there would be an organization taking care of that, and we would only have to be concerned about recycling. So I think having a clear partnership with the government or semi-governmental organizations will help. Clear regulation helps because right now importing batteries from abroad is prohibited in Thailand. And also making it clear to foreign companies who can bring in the technology what benefits they will get if they invest in such a facility here in Thailand would be very helpful.
Thank you, Kun Jeff. Yes, I'm sure clarity would definitely make things easier. Dr. Natakon, I would like to pass the mic to you.
Okay, thank you. I think I fully agree with our speakers that for scope 3, probably we can accomplish through collaborations because it's actually the value chain emissions, right? And the really important thing is that we need alliance along the value chains. We need, for example, for GC business, right? We purchase some crude oil from internationally. And we actually expect that there could be some information and pathway from the players on how they would like to reduce the greenhouse gas along the value chain. But we found that actually transparency for this value chain is still limited. So meaning that not just only collaboration, but somehow we need some educations and also some instrument from governments, either it's going to be in terms of technology knowledge or financial to support decarbonization of the value chain together. And also for our customer, you can see that even though we're saying that we will develop the products that going to help them decarbonize their value chain or their production process, but somehow there going to be some costs associated with this kind of the product as well, like Brad mentioned in terms of the bio things, right? So it's not just only the industrial that we make alliance and collaboration, but there should be some support from the governments and also standards of the industrial to support this kind of the thing as well. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Natakon. Actually, I would like to delve further into regulation since all of our panelists have spoken to some degree about government support. From government funding of clean technology to regulations allowing the purchase of renewable energy credits, what complementary regulations specifically are required locally and regionally to support companies in achieving net zero? Jeff, I'd like to start with you.
I think if I bring it back to critical minerals and electrification of transportation, I think it would help a great deal if there is clarity on the agenda that the government has here when it comes to production of EVs in Thailand. Thailand is often referred to as the Detroit of Asia, Southeast Asia. And I think that's definitely true when it comes to the production of internal combustion engine vehicles. And I believe that Thailand can play a similar role in the future by making it very clear that they want to extend that scope with EV production here in Thailand. Right now, that has not been communicated in a consistent and clear way. It could be better, I think. And you see some hesitation from major automotive OEMs, car makers, to then come in and make the investments that we need to get EVs rolling out, basically.
Thanks, Jeff. Poom, would you like to add to that?
Again, emphasizing the importance of clear policy, consistent policy, and strong incentives. But also, I may be in the minority for the business community here that we need both carrots and sticks. So healthy for companies do not follow the rules can be a powerful incentive. Let me use an example, not totally related, but tangentially related to climate change, and that is waste management, right? Waste management right now is really weak. Sorry to speak my mind, but if we have a stronger and enforceable policy on waste management, requiring people, residential, commercial, industry, to really segregate their waste and manage the entire flow, the potential of our circular economy system in terms of material management. Similarly, if we apply the same thinking to climate change, I think again, going back to my repeated message is clear policy, consistent, enforceable. I think that's my message.
Thank you very much, Poom. Dr. Natakon, what do you think about carrots and sticks that companies need to achieve net zero?
Yes, I think I do agree with Poom that firstly, we need clear directions on the country level, right? On what would be the direction that the government would like to drive going forward, and what would be the support that they can, provide to the industry. I think this will not just only, accelerate the interesting from industry, but also trying to increase the availabilities of the, for example, renewable energy pools, and also trying to promote the renewable energy credit trading mechanism and momentum in Thailand. So if there should be some clear, financial instrument and some policy support, I think it will be the critical things to drive the momentum in these areas and make the corporates and also others, international company to participate in this area in more extent.
Thank you, Dr. Natakon. Brad, I would like to now hand you the proverbial mic.
Sure. Just a couple of thoughts. In echoing what all the other speakers have mentioned, one would be, companies, global companies, right? That are looking to reduce Scope 2 emissions may have an easier time reducing their Scope 2 emissions if they have access to renewable energy credits, IRECs, etc. In Thailand, it seems a little more difficult to have a transparent and large market for acquiring those kind of certificates, ECAs. So that would be probably something to expand, as well as virtual PPAs to make those available so that companies in country could accelerate their Scope 2 emission reductions. And then the other that I'm intrigued by is biocircular economy. That seems to be getting some attention here in Thailand, the whole biocircular green initiative. But the level of detail, I would assume the other speakers could address this far more clearly as to whether or not it's clear enough, and is the roadway clear enough so that they know that how they can leverage that initiative and interest from the government. Because certainly globally, biocircular economy will be very essential to meeting both decarbonization, but also nature focused initiatives. So it's a great initiative here in Thailand, but its clarity, at least to me, is probably not where it ought to be to truly incentivize corporate action.
Thank you, Brad. And to all panelists, I would ask, are there any particular countries that we should be using as an example who have excellent guidelines?
Yeah, I think if you look at Northwestern Europe, two examples come to mind. One is Norway and one is Germany. I think both countries have proven that, once the government acts as an initiator of one piece of that supply chain, the rest of the ecosystem will follow. And just to make the link back to inviting EV companies here to produce EVs, once that happens here in Thailand, it will open up a whole ecosystem of battery and EV related business, including recycling of the batteries that come back from the EVs, but also the processing of critical minerals. And that will allow a country really to step up to the next level and create a green tech based economy. So I think Germany and Norway are two very good examples of countries that have done it in that way and have succeeded in creating their own ecosystem.
Thank you, Kunjeff. I would now like to shift the conversation slightly to offsets, which is our third question for the day. What is the role of carbon offsets, so that is to say, compensation for greenhouse gas emissions through activities such as reforestation or afforestation, in a company's decarbonization plan? When should they be used, and what type of offsets are best for different companies? Dr. Natakon, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. I think in terms of offsets for GC, I think that should be our last tier to decarbonize the carbon from our emission from facilities. We're saying this because I think our intention is that for the first tier, we will trying to do our best to reduce the emission from our production's manufacturing process. And also in terms of the product offering, we will trying to fully apply the circular economy concept to help reducing not just only waste, but trying to close the loop and allows the material to be reused as a raw material for our process as well, to help the requirement for the virgin feedstocks. And then we are fully aware that by doing this kind of the two things more effectively, there should be some emission left. And this is how important of the offsets to place in this kind of the games. And for our approach, I think we set up two approach. Actually three major approach for the offset. Firstly, I think it's not just really offset, but trying to make compensation through the technologies, for example, carbon captures. And in terms of the offset, we trying to do the natural-based solutions activities, for example, forestation, that we think that is the activity that we can do today. And also we are trying to see if we can collect carbon credit and do a kind of the carbon trading as well to help offsetting the rest of our carbon accountings. So this is the way that GC trying to manage our greenhouse gas emission through the offset.
Thank you, Dr. Natakon. Kun Poom?
I would like to actually reflect Dr. Natakon and Kun Brad's comment. I think Kun Brad's last few slides was perfect in summarizing the type of offset, right, that we should be looking at and when they are appropriate. But I think it's imperative that we must recognize that even with all the possible measures or the practical ways to reduce our own emission, there will still be some left within our own operation. So as well as our scope 3 emissions, right? So having using offsets is a recognition of that fact, and we see it as a communication tools to net zero and offset is, and we really use offset as the last resort, as the final solution, then it's necessary, and I think it's not totally fair to classify all users of offsets as greenwashing, because actually, from what we see currently, is companies that use offsets are actually quite active in reducing their own emissions, right? So they're both active on both fronts. And so again, offsets are used to create awareness, communication tool. I think that's appropriate. And also echoing Dr. Nathakorn's comment about nature-based solution, reforestation, and also Kun Brad's comment about offsets coming from projects that also have co-benefits in terms of driving for ESG, for example. And looking at community-based agriculture and forestry, mostly. Yeah.
Thank you. Kun Jeff, would you please add to the conversation on offsets?
I have nothing to add, really. I agree with all that has been said already.
Wonderful, thank you. And Brad?
Just to add a couple of things that, offsetting can get a bit of a bad rap from some folks. And I can see why in some cases, but in many cases, I don't. Especially if it's nature-based solutions, forest carbon offsetting, genuine projects. We've attempted to do projects that would have done tremendous good. Mangrove restoration projects or conservation, that has immediate adaptation benefits beyond the carbon that really protects lives, that has value. You can't monetize that, but you can monetize carbon. So you can bring revenue into communities that desperately need it, leading with carbon. You can improve soil health, water, air quality, food security. There are so many co-benefits to a well-done nature-based solution project that the carbon offset that you get from it is one piece. But all these other pieces are extremely critical. And if you combine that with creating shared value or SDG outcomes that companies need to do, or task force on nature, based disclosures, right? That's a new program that's coming up that's going to require companies to really understand their impact and dependencies on nature. Incorporating that into your strategy around forest-based, conservation is really meaningful, and there's no reason to wait until 2040 to do that. There's a real need to do that today. So if you take that systems level view, that broad view of carbon, especially around land-based projects, I think is really valuable. If it's being done so that you don't have to change your business at all, then that's not wise, because people will see that and call it out. So those would be my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. And on a closing note, I'd like to ask all panelists if you have any advice for companies that are just starting off on this net zero journey, where to start. It can be very overwhelming. Perhaps starting with Kun Jeff?
Sure. I think keep it close to yourself, and it can be overwhelming. It's a lot to digest, at least from my experience. So I would say if you don't necessarily know what to do, start looking at how to make your production process more efficient, how you can start with energy savings. Small things help as well. Things like travel policy revisions, doing more by using digital tools. And then for the big stuff, you can hire AWR Lloyd to advise. Would my advice be? But yeah, that's what I would say.
A double thank you to you. Kun Poom?
Yes. So I think the very often repeated cliche of you can't manage what you can't measure. So starting with a complete understanding, a complete inventory of your greenhouse gas emissions, and understand what factor drive those emissions. And like everyone else on the panel mentioned, understanding the hotspots. What are the major emissions sources, and find solutions to prioritize by cost, by ease of implementation, etc. And just like any other management decision, right? You prioritize the cost effectiveness, the outcome, and then you implement it. But it has to be coming down from the top, right? If the top executive of the organization do not take that as a major business decision and treat it as a side project, as a quote unquote external after process CSR project, or to use the word greenwashing, etc. So it has to be coming from internal business decision that we want to really to future-proof our business, to dissociate our growth with our emission, and that would make sense in terms of your business strategy. Yes.
Thank you. I think that's excellent advice. Dr. Natakon?
Yes, I think I do agree with what Kun Pooms and also Jeff has mentioned, that I think firstly we need to understand what are the current baseline of your business and what are the hotspots. And you may also need to understand what will be the key driving force for your business to reach the net zero or develop the decarbonization ways. Either it's going to be your stakeholders, either it's going to be the regulations or any other things. For example, the change of the customers preferential, for example. And then I think currently there are some viable tools that you can use. For example, there is a TCFD tools framework that you can use to evaluate what will be the business impacts based on the climate action, compare between do not things and do the right things. And then you will have clear pictures to talk to the top management. And then the top tone is really important for the corporate to drive the executions. And if you have already set the corporate tone to accomplish the net zero or decarbonization way, I think there is still some standards and tools that you can still follow as well. For example, a science-based target, net zero initiative, or others that you can still use this as a framework, as your initial move, and decide what will be the action that you would like to take in the short terms, and also trying to study what will be the really needed for the long-term action for the corporates as well.
Thank you, Dr. Natakon. Brad, closing notes?
Yeah, just one thought would be, like, from the big picture perspective is we looked at one of those charts that show you just how deep decarbonization must be over the next 80 years. And it's a radical transformation of our economy. And for essentially for every company, decarbonization should start to enter into your sense of purpose at the company, right? So to energize the company around how do we accelerate or play a meaningful role in this deep decarbonization. I assume for all the speakers, from Jeff, Poom, and Natakorn, that look at the CVCs. I imagine 5 years ago, climate was not central to CVC discussions, maybe 6 years or so ago. I assume that's quite different today, right? The innovation, the strategy is really around decarbonization. So I think part of it is just to get energized by that big picture, that your firm has a strong role in contributing to decarbonization. And then once that energy is there, it's going to be a lot easier to have the right focus, have the right team commitment to do all the things that are necessary, the building blocks of carbon accounting, to getting teams to communicate and engage with each other on how to manage this transition.
Thank you. And a big thank you to all four of you for your really candid insights and your very practical advice. On that note, I'd like to wrap up the panel discussion and hand the floor back to Khun Natnisha.
Well, once again, thank you, Mr. Danik, Mr. Amrish Ritu, Dr. Natakon, Mr. Poom, and Ms. Katari for the insightful talk. Now, we have come to the end of our fruitful afternoon, and I would like to express appreciation and our supportive sponsors: Bangja Corporate Public Company Limited, Beta Grow Public Company Limited, Kasikorn Bank Public Company Limited, PTT Public Company Limited, Siam Commercial Bank Public Company Limited, SCG, and Thai Oil Public Company Limited. And we would appreciate if you could complete the evaluation and provide us your feedback by clicking questionnaire at the bottom below. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link of today's webinar records and the presentations for our speakers. Lastly, please stay tuned for the upcoming program, the fourth event of TMA ESG series, the State of Green Finance, on 9th September 2021. We'll bring together experts to provide an overview of the key trends and benefits for investors and businesses when it comes to raising and deploying green finance. On behalf of TMA, thank you for joining us today and see you again on September 9th. Please keep an eye on our events. Thank you. ขอบคุณค่ะ